Hey everyone, I'm really excited to have you guys back for my Where Will We Go From Here series. It's Imran Khan again, and I'm here with two people I'm incredibly excited to introduce. I have Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm. They're both senior lecturers at Yale University, and they both co-founded and co-direct the Forum of Religion and Ecology at Yale University. And they actually just launched a new website for that, which is linked below. So you can definitely go check that out. They're also spearheaded an incredible multimedia effort called Journey of the Universe, which also has a new site, which includes an Emmy award-winning film that was broadcast on PBS and is now available on Amazon Prime. So lots of really interesting work that John and Mary Evelyn have done. So thank you so much for both giving me some of your time and being here with me today.
Good to be with you, Amy.
Thank you.
So before we get started, I'd actually love to have you guys talk a little bit about your work on the Forum on Religion and Ecology. I know you guys have done an incredible amount of work. If you wouldn't mind taking a couple of seconds to talk a little bit about that, then we can jump into the questions I have for you.
So we initiated this project on religion and ecology, we could say 40 years ago in conversations with Thomas Berry, our teacher at Fordham University, and Mary Evelyn went on to do studies at Columbia and East Asian Studies. Thomas Berry had a particular insight and incredible capacity to articulate the relationship of stories that people told about reality, especially in religious traditions, and the connections to the environment. So that was the impetus, the drive to understand how did the religions of the world relate through communities and individuals to the local bioregion. So then we started a project at Harvard.
So we realized we weren't scientists or policy people or lawyers, but as historians of world religions, and we had spent 10 years studying these traditions with some of the greatest teachers, how can we bring forward these teachings, wisdom traditions, practices, indigenous viewpoints, cosmovisions, for a cultural shift, which is what we're going to talk about today, a paradigm shift. And so we did 10 conferences at Harvard, 10 books, and then we're invited to Yale to bring the Forum on Religion and Ecology there. So that's the story.
And we like to talk about a field in force, an academic field, which we can call religion and ecology, but also, and very importantly, a religious environmentalism, on the ground activity on the part of these religions.
I think this is so incredible and so relevant to what's going on in the world today, right? I think one of the quotes that strikes me so much is the Thomas Berry quote, we can't have healthy people on a sick planet. That really resonates with me. And I think that's a good kind of a good segue into my first question that I often ask. So what has really been the impact of the current crisis and the current state of affairs on this field of religion and ecology? And what are people thinking? What are people, what's the zeitgeist around this at the moment?
One thing that strikes me is the sense of containment. We're still in place in the United States, and there's been some move towards opening up. But over these past weeks, I think we have had an incredible experience of limits. And I think part of the project in religion and ecology is to understand how traditions have looked upon limits and have actually structured limiting life in some productive way. I'm thinking of Ramadan fast or ways in which traditions ask their participants to willingly undertake, the word sacrifice is used sometimes, but for a larger good or for the sense of personal transformation. And I think the containment now under the current pandemic has brought this into a new mode of reflection. We're thinking more deeply about what's happened to us.
Yeah, and I think that the limits has extended, as John said, to religious services online, right? Passover services, Easter services, and so on. And people have said they've been in touch with family members they've never had a chance in years to be at a Sabbath and Passover service, for example, or Easter or Ramadan. So there's this peculiar isolation and connection going on at the same time. And Zoom is peculiar, but there is an intimacy, isn't there, about this closeness of face and so on. So I think the notion that there's limits, but there's also potential religious services. And maybe just to conclude, everyone, I think, is looking for deeper spiritual understandings, ways forward. This is breaking us open to a journey of our life that we know we will never be the same. And so people are looking for these wisdom traditions and human earth relations in these traditions. And I think it will be an opening that will be very beneficial for the earth community in the long run.
It's also interesting too that we had an awareness of our environmental problems, from environmental degradation of soils or water, and the sense of biodiversity loss and climate change. And suddenly in the midst of this now, we have the pandemic. And instead of wiping those issues off the table, I think it's provided a moment we're trying to look more deeply at the human-earth relationship. Certainly human-human, we're very concerned about the social justice issues and how deeply people of lower incomes are suffering in this moment too. Right. But we have a sense that we ask the questions, where did the pandemic come from? And so biodiversity, we don't know exactly, but perhaps in animal markets. And so the relationship of humans and biodiversity, it's all folded together, isn't it? It's a very interesting time that we're thinking about these issues.
You know, it's really, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Mary Evelyn. No. Just my one little reflection on that is I'm currently fasting for Ramadan. And this really resonates with me, what you've been saying, particularly because this is the first time in so many years where I really haven't been able to go to services and be around other people who are making these limiting choices, albeit for religion. And it's had its own psychological impact. And I think that interconnectedness in terms of the way that we are with each other, or the time we spend with each other, has really, really come profoundly to the forefront for me in a way that hasn't previously. Sorry, that just was small.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I was just on another Zoom call this morning with the Vatican, which is working on this anniversary of Laudato Si, the encyclical of Pope Francis. So all next week, there are going to be webinars and talks and discussions on just what John was saying, integral ecology, people and planet, cry of the earth, cry of the poor, the most vulnerable. I mean, we had reports on this meeting about 20 people from Africa. What's happening is they're already dealing with pandemics. They're dealing with Ebola and measles and so on, in addition to flooding. It's just, it's heartbreaking. But the Pope is going to announce tomorrow a whole year of reflection on this encyclical as a body of inspiration, I would say, for eco-justice, for climate justice, and so on. So these are very hopeful moments, I think, and we could say more, but I just wanted to put that in how the religions are responding.
I think this is actually a perfect segue into what's my usual second question, right? Now that you guys have spoken about the impact, let's talk a little bit about why that impact is so important, right? I'm really curious to unpack with both of you what you think some of these short-term issues will be around how this is going to be beneficial, and then long-term. I mean, do you really see us learning from this as a planetary body? One of the things that happened after the 2008 crisis was there was this moment where the Earth was allowed to breathe, right? But then we kind of ramped up production, went right back into our bad habits. And I'm curious, what do you see as a potential future here in terms of those short-term, long-term consequences of what's going on?
Yeah, we're definitely caught, aren't we, in the question of putting people back to work, so jobs, and that's tied to productive activity, and the whole connection then to increased consumption. And I think that's some would see the normal we want to get back to. And on the other side are the issues we've been talking about, a sense of appropriate limits and finding a way to live with our extractive economies and our industrial societies in ways that might benefit the larger Earth community. I would just end with a term I use in my studies of small-scale societies, the Adivasi peoples or Orang Asli or native peoples, these small societies often called indigenous. And the term that I like to use is Lifeway, rather than religion, actually, because religion often has so much baggage.
Right.
But Lifeway suggests that these practices and virtues and values of deeper meaning are tied into life. And I think this period of the pandemic is bringing us into Lifeway reflections that are deeply religious. And so we're seeing the impact in our daily life at home and on the larger national economies and certainly internationally also. So these are some deep questions ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And just to build on that, I would say there's research, education, and outreach in this field of religion and ecology and in the force. So the research is exploding in a more integrated way with science, partnering with policy to say there's a moral force here, and there's systemic change that needs to happen. Again, this morning on the Vatican call, there was, this economic system is not working, it needs to change. This technocratic mindset that technology is going to save us needs to be changed. So this is a fascinating synergy in this particular moment of bringing together worldviews, cosmovisions, ethical points of views. The civil rights movement in the US was greatly inspired by religious communities, especially the Jewish and Christian communities, saying segregation, separate but equal, no. The slavery movement in Europe, in the UK, was especially inspired by the Quakers, saying this is an unfair economic arrangement. We have the same arguments. This is fossil fuel is economically, viable and going forward. No, we have to change that mindset, that shift. So I think this is a moment of huge opening. As I just said, the research, but the educational systems, the seminaries are beginning to get this eco-justice, and the outreach, all kinds of both protests over fossil fuel pipelines and so on. Stop the Money pipeline this week with the JP Morgan chase and with Liberty Mutual Insurance and with BlackRock, saying we can't continue to do this. And just finally, the religious communities weighing in on those issues and on divestment. They've been huge in this movement. And many of the universities, Georgetown and Seattle University, Dayton, they've divested. The Church of England divested, the UCC community, and on and on. They're a good percentage of now a $14 trillion effort to say this is not acceptable. And the percentage of religious communities is very high, 35%, I believe, of that.
I was thinking, remembering after the 1918 influenza, the Roaring Twenties came forward. So there was a sense then of people who really wanted to celebrate. And what people say to me, well, it was after World War I also, and there was that sense of recovering some normal. So I'm intrigued again, what will we choose? Will we want to just celebrate and then in unlimited ways? Or will this be like the frog in the boiling water? That the normal, like the water comes up heating very slowly, and we impose upon the earth our will in these normal ways. But suddenly when we have a pandemic moment, we realize we're in the boiling pot. And I think we want to jump out in some way, but where we jump to, that's the question.
Yeah, I think this is like the perfect segue into, the title of this program, right? Well, where do we go from here? Like, what's your advice if you were speaking to young people, young people who are involved in these seminaries, involved in these religious movements, are taking on the mantle of some of this eco-activism to radically think about how we shape our future? What's your advice? Where do you think we should go from here?
I feel hope. I feel young people also teach us. We encounter our students in class, and I'm constantly buoyed up by the fact that these students feel they can do something in the face of these environmental challenges. And I'm so lifted up. My own teaching is inspired by them. And at the same time, I want to impart to them hope. And the deeper hope, Mary Evelyn will talk about the journey of the universe perspective, but I wanted to just mention the Earth community. We live in the midst of all of these incredible voices that speak of their coming out of the evolutionary processes and this sense of how they have arrived in this current place that they are on Earth. These are incredibly hopeful dialogues that we're having now with the larger Earth community.
Yeah, and I think it's a great place to just open this to say the religions, while they have their problems, they have their promise.
Yes.
Very important. The religions are necessary, but not sufficient.
Good.
Because what John just said, there's a whole spiritual flood coming forward right now, right? And people are responding to this restoration of nature that we're feeling and experiencing of birds and foxes coming in our yard and things like that. So we've just launched a Living Earth community book of writers who are nature writers talking about the sentience, the different forms of awareness, from trees communicating to fungi communicating to plants moving towards the sun to migration patterns. In other words, this whole Earth community is imprinted with different types of intelligences, and incorporating this into a much vaster environmentalism, if you will, much even vaster eco-justice understanding. And I think just two things to offer concretely is the journey of the universe is a spiritual and scientific story of this 14 billion year unfolding universe. How do we belong to it? And there's interviews that I did with scientists and environmentalists and historians to open up, how do galaxies form? How does this incredible Earth system come into being? So all of that is an offering into a new story, a new paradigm, and so on. And I just want to conclude with, I think most of all, I like to say an intergenerational handshake to the next generation. That's why it's so fun to do this with you, Andy. An intergenerational handshake is absolutely at the heart of all of this discussion. So thank you.
And just to mention too, the Living Earth community book that you mentioned is open source, so it's available free around the planet.
Great. I can also link to that in the
Thanks,
information below. I think this is really great. This is such an interesting way to think not only about really this question of where do we fundamentally go from here. I think for me, it's been so, just life affirming to see the hope that both of you have for not only young people taking up a mantle, but also faith-based communities, communities beyond faith-based communities, spiritual communities are thinking about really how do we help harbor a new age in which we're really taking care of the planet we live on. And I think that's fundamentally important to discuss.
Yes, Amy, we entirely agree. We see that, and many people say to us, well, are religious leaders standing up? And my response is yes, and not only religious leaders, lay people, communities are standing up.
Yeah, women, and just to pick up that intergenerational, again, this morning in the conversation, people all over the world, it ended exactly on this note. Intergenerational justice will be part of the Pope's future statements. And, we see that in the Children's Trust. It's a lawsuit here in the US that says our future is being foreshortened. And there's a right to a healthy planet. And we begin again on this sense of the people can't be healthy on a sick planet. So this whole sense of justice for the next generation, and these movements, Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg, this is part of this intergenerational moment that I hope will grow.
And if we're moving towards a planetary consciousness, it has to be multiform. There is no one story, there is no one answer to all of this. What happens in South Asia and India will be different than China, different than Europe or the American hemisphere. But somehow or other, we have the capacity to live with one another and allow that multiform awareness to emerge, even as we realize we share the planet together.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that's something that's really been instilled in me, having lived all around the world.
I've
Just,
sensed that.
yeah,
Yes.
I think,
Yes.
growing up very American, growing up in New York, and then having some experiences around the world, I think this is something that also comes a little bit with being a person of dual culture. I'm Pakistani
Mhm.
American, and I think there's definitely an awareness of that in terms of exactly the way you're describing. Well, I cannot express to you how grateful I am that both of you took the time to speak with me. And I think it'll be really interesting to look back on this conversation perhaps a year from now or a year and a half from now and see, what we did with that intergenerational handshake and how
Fantastic.
that mantle was taken forward. I mean, quite frankly, I think it's really neat to think that this is a moment in which young people really can stand up for their right to a future and their right to have inherit a planet that's healthy, right?
Yes.
So
Yes. Here's the handshake.
Yeah.
the handshake.
We love this. Thank you so much. This was
Thank-
really, really wonderful. Great questions.
Very special.
Appreciate it. And I really, really am looking forward to hopefully future conversations around this as well.
Same here.
Appreciate it.
Keep in
Take
good
care.
health. See